The Endeavour was gliding smoothly through the quiet expanse of space, a journey that had already lasted several days. Inside the ship, the crew was a mix of humans and aliens from different worlds. Captain Rice Hamilton, a calm and experienced leader, stood in front of the crew, briefing them on the mission ahead. His ship was headed toward an uncharted planet, but first, they had to get through the deep space. The crew members, including the tall and muscular Zurichs and the graceful, delicate Xalites, were all doing their work as usual. Everyone was focused, keeping busy with their tasks. The atmosphere inside the ship was calm, as it usually was during space travel. But suddenly, without warning, a loud alarm echoed through the hallways. Warning: cooling system failure. Internal temperature rising, the computer's cold voice announced. Riss quickly turned to his engineering officer, a Zurich named Varnek. Varnek's large, powerful body, covered in tattoos that told stories of battles won, tensed as he examined the console. "It's the AC," Varnek growled, frustration clear in his voice. "The cooling system has gone offline. The temperature is going to rise fast." Rice frowned, immediately calculating the situation. It wasn't a small problem. The ship's cooling system regulated everything from the temperature to the air quality. Without it, the ship would get unbearably hot. "Get it fixed, Varnek. As quickly as possible," Riz ordered. "Everyone, stay calm. We'll get through this." The crew, mostly humans, exchanged nervous glances. Riz knew they had little time. The temperature inside the ship was already rising, and the cool, controlled air began to feel heavier and more uncomfortable. Within minutes, the temperature inside the ship reached 80 degrees Fahrenheit, then 90 degrees Fahrenheit. Soon, beads of sweat appeared on the foreheads of the crew. The Xalites, who were not used to such heat, looked visibly uncomfortable. Their smooth, pale skin shimmered with sweat as they shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Captain Rice Hamilton, however, remained calm. His human crew members didn't seem bothered at all. As the temperature reached 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the humans began to remove their outer layers. Rice took off his jacket, then his shirt, revealing his well-built physique. One of the Xalites, a female named Lyra, turned her head away, clearly shocked by the humans' casual attitude toward the heat. Her people valued modesty and formality, and the sight of humans stripping down without hesitation seemed completely foreign to her. The Zurich's crew members, too, began to remove their clothing, their powerful muscles and inked skin now exposed. Yet they did so with a noticeable sense of discomfort. For them, taking off their clothes in front of others was a breach of their warrior culture's code of honor. Riz noticed their hesitation and gave them a friendly smile. "Don't worry, everyone. It's just heat, nothing to get upset about." But the alien crew didn't find it so simple. The Xalites and Zurichs exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to react to such an open display of human confidence. Riz and his human crew, however, seemed unfazed, even joking about the heat and making light of the situation. As the temperature climbed higher, reaching 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the humans were fine. But the aliens were sweating, clearly struggling with the discomfort. The tension in the air was growing, and Riz knew this was just the beginning. The crew members, now partially undressed, exchanged uncertain looks. Riz stood tall, unfazed by the discomfort, confident that the crew would adapt as they always did. But deep down, he could feel the unease. It wasn't just the heat, there was something more at play here. And soon, it would all come to a head. The temperature inside the Endeavour kept rising. The ship's cooling system was still down, and the air felt thick and suffocating. Now at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, sweat dripped from everyone's faces, and the heat was becoming unbearable. Yet, while the human crew members continued to work as if nothing was wrong, the alien crew was visibly uncomfortable. Lyra, one of the Xalites, wiped her forehead, her smooth skin now glistening with sweat. Her delicate features were twisted in discomfort. She wasn't used to such heat, and it was making her feel more vulnerable than she'd like to admit. Xalites were known for their intelligence. Their culture focused on mental abilities rather than physical strength, and they were used to cool, controlled environments. Heat was something they could never handle well. She glanced at Rice, the human captain, who was still calm and unbothered. He'd removed his shirt earlier, and now his body was clearly sweating, but it didn't seem to bother him. The humans, with their rugged adaptability, appeared perfectly fine with the situation. Lyra couldn't understand it. Why were they acting as though it was just another day in space? It felt like they were showing off, almost daring the rest of them to admit they were struggling. Then there was Varnak, the Xerix warrior. His large, muscular frame was covered in sweat, and his face was tense. The Xerix were a proud race, known for their strength and warrior culture. They'd rarely showed weakness, and this heat was testing them in ways they had never been tested before. The Xerix were uncomfortable with their own discomfort. They were used to hot environments, but this oppressive heat, combined with the lack of clothing, felt almost humiliating. Varnak stood tall, trying his best not to show how much the heat bothered him. He had removed his tunic, leaving his strong, tattooed chest exposed. His dark eyes flashed with annoyance as he looked around at the other crew members. His people never showed weakness, but here they were, half-dressed, sweaty, and unable to fix the problem. Riz noticed Varnak's discomfort and couldn't help but smile. "Still prefer the heat over the cold, huh?" Rice teased, trying to lighten the mood. Varnak grunted. "This is different. It's not the same." He crossed his arms, clearly annoyed, but Race could see that he was starting to adjust. Lyra, still trying to make sense of the situation, turned to one of her fellow Xalites, Kylan. He, too, had removed his robes, his long, thin body now exposed. Kylan's eyes darted nervously around the room, uncomfortable with the situation. He was the most reserved of the Xalites, and the heat seemed to be making him more anxious than ever. "It's hard to focus," Kylan said softly, wiping sweat from his brow. "The heat makes it hard to think clearly." Lyra nodded in agreement. They both were used to environments where everything was in balance, where the temperature was controlled, and the air was cool and crisp. The heat in the Endeavor felt foreign to them. It was like nothing they had experienced before. Meanwhile, the human crew was still calm. Riz looked over at his team and gave a small, reassuring smile. They didn't seem fazed at all. They had adapted to the heat, moving smoothly through their tasks, even cracking jokes along the way. It wasn't just their ability to tolerate the temperature that amazed the aliens. It was their confidence in it. "Anyone want to play a round of cards?" joked one of the humans, Aaron, as he casually shuffled a deck. Lyra stared at him, her eyebrows furrowed. She couldn't understand how they could be so relaxed. The heat was unbearable for her, and yet, here they were, almost as though it was nothing more than a mild inconvenience. Riz noticed the aliens' discomfort and understood their confusion. It wasn't just the heat that bothered them. It was how easily the humans had adjusted to it. Riz, however, remained focused. He knew the real problem wasn't the heat. It was the breakdown of the ship's systems. They needed to get the cooling system back online as quickly as possible. "Stay focused," Race said, his voice calm. "We'll fix it, and we'll get through this together." Despite his calm demeanor, he couldn't shake the feeling that the heat was more than just an uncomfortable challenge. It was pushing the crew's limits, both mentally and physically. And in this kind of situation, every moment counted. The heat inside the Endeavor was now unbearable. It had been hours since the cooling system broke down, and the temperature inside the ship had climbed steadily. Now it was over 120 degrees Fahrenheit, and the air felt thick, almost suffocating. Sweat poured down everyone's faces, and the ship's metal floors felt like they were radiating heat. The crew, both human and alien, were struggling to stay focused. Captain Rice Hamilton was still standing tall, unaffected by the growing heat. His shirt was already gone, and now his pants had been discarded as well. He worked with his team as if it was any other day in space, his calmness acting as a steadying influence on the crew. The Zurichs, on the other hand, were having a harder time. Varnak, their proud warrior leader, stood near the control panel, trying to get the cooling system back online. His muscular frame was now completely exposed, his skin glistening with sweat as he worked furiously. The tattoos on his arms and chest glowed under the bright lights, but even the proud Zurichs was starting to show signs of discomfort. "Where is the problem?" Varnak. Reyes asked, his voice steady, though there was an edge of impatience beneath it. Varnak growled in frustration. "The system's fried. It's not a simple fix. It might take hours to repair." At this point, the human crew was starting to feel the heat as well, but they managed to keep their focus. Aaron, one of Rise's crew members, wiped his forehead and cracked a joke, trying to lighten the mood. "Maybe we should take a swim in the engine room," Aaron said with a grin. But Lyra, the Xiolite, wasn't in the mood for jokes. She had taken off most of her robes by now, revealing her slim, elegant frame. But her discomfort was clear. She wiped the sweat off her brow for the 10th time, her face tight with frustration. The heat was unbearable, and her mind, usually so sharp and focused, felt fuzzy. It was as though her thoughts were moving slower than usual. "The humans," she murmured to herself. "How do they handle this? They don't even seem bothered by the heat." It was true. The humans were managing the situation in a way that baffled her. While the Zurichs and Xalites seemed to struggle, the humans remained relaxed. They worked efficiently, never complaining, never showing weakness. Varnak looked over at Rise, his expression a mix of annoyance and grudging respect. "Your people are different," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Rise caught the words but didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to the control panel where Varnak was working, trying to find a way to help. He placed a hand on Varnak's shoulder, offering his support. "We'll get through this, Varnak. We always do," Race said, his voice reassuring. But inside, Race couldn't help but worry. The temperature was rising too quickly, and the ship's systems weren't responding. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a mechanical failure. It was a test of their teamwork, of their ability to survive under extreme conditions. The tension between the aliens and the humans was building as well. The Zurichs had always been proud of their strength, and the Xalites valued their intellect. Yet in this heat, both seemed to struggle. The humans, however, were adapting quickly. Reyes watched as his crew moved through the ship with ease, working together like a well-oiled machine. Varnak looked at Reyes and nodded, his face still grim. "I don't know if I can fix this in time," he admitted. "We don't need perfection," Reyes replied. "We need to survive. Let's keep working together." At that moment, Lyra and Kylan, the other Xalite, both approached Reyes, their faces marked by frustration and exhaustion. It wasn't just the heat, it was the feeling of helplessness that came with it. The Xalites, who prided themselves on their intellectual abilities, couldn't find a solution. The Zurichs, the great warriors, couldn't overpower the heat. And the humans, they were thriving in a way that made the aliens uneasy. The temperature inside the Endeavor had now reached an unbearable 130 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was thick, and the heat was making it harder for the crew to focus. Sweat dripped from every member of the crew, their clothes clinging to their skin. Reyes, the human captain, was used to pushing through tough situations, but even he was beginning to feel the weight of the heat. The rest of his crew, however, seemed to be handling it with ease, moving around the ship without complaint. The aliens, however, were another story. Varnak, the Zurich's warrior, stood near the control panel, his massive arms trembling slightly with exhaustion. The heat had drained his energy, and though he had once been proud of his ability to handle extreme conditions, the steady rise in temperature was beginning to challenge him in ways he had never experienced before. The sweat on his skin, combined with his discomfort, made him feel vulnerable, a feeling that no Zurich's warrior ever allowed themselves to feel. He looked over at Rice, the human leader, who was still calmly issuing orders to the crew. There was no sign of hesitation or struggle in Rice. His team of humans had adapted to the heat without so much as a second thought. Varnak had to admit it. The humans were different. They had some kind of strength that seemed to go beyond the physical. Why are they not struggling? Varnak muttered to himself, feeling a mix of curiosity and frustration. Across the room, Lyra, the Xylite, was having a similar experience. She had never felt so out of control. The heat was clouding her mind, making it harder for her to think clearly. Her people were known for their intellect, their ability to solve complex problems. But in this moment, it seemed like nothing was working. Her robes were long gone, replaced with only a simple, light garment, yet the heat still made her feel sluggish and weak. She turned to Kylan, the other Xylite, who was standing nearby, his face a mixture of concern and embarrassment. "I can't think straight," Lyra said, her voice low. "This heat is making it impossible to focus." Kylan nodded, wiping his brow. "I feel the same. We've been taught to stay calm in any situation, but this is different. The humans, they seem unaffected. I don't understand how." Lyra glanced at Rice. The human captain was leaning over a console, calmly running through diagnostics on the cooling system. He wasn't struggling like they were. His face didn't show any sign of distress. It was as if the heat was something he had faced before, as if it didn't even matter to him. Varnak, unable to keep his thoughts to himself, finally spoke. "Riz, we've been at this for hours. The cooling system is beyond our reach. How do you keep going? We can barely think. You seem unaffected." Rice turned toward him, his expression calm but his eyes sharp. He could see the frustration in Varnak's face, and knew that the Zurich's warrior wasn't used to feeling helpless. "I'm not going to pretend that it's easy," Rice said, his voice firm. "But we don't have time to stop. We keep going because it's what we do. Humans adapt. When things get tough, we find a way through it." Varnak's brow furrowed. "Adapt. But how?" Riss smiled slightly. "It's not about power or intelligence. It's about willpower. It's about not giving up when things seem impossible." Lyra stood silently, her mind spinning. There was a lot she didn't understand, but one thing was clear. The humans had something their species didn't: the ability to push through when the odds were stacked against them. Kylan spoke quietly, his voice tinged with awe. "Maybe we should try adapting too." The words hung in the air, and for the first time since the breakdown, Lyra felt a flicker of hope. She had always believed that intellect and knowledge were the most important things. But now, seeing the humans and their resilience, she realized there was something more to survival than just being smart or strong. It was determination. As the crew continued to struggle in the heat, the humans, with their simple but effective resilience, started to gain the respect of the alien crew. The lines between the two species began to blur. They were no longer just humans and aliens. They were survivors, all fighting the same battle. And the battle wasn't over yet. The temperature in the Endeavor was now close to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the heat was no longer just uncomfortable. It was starting to feel dangerous. The air felt thick, like it was pressing in from all sides. The crew was struggling to keep their focus, their bodies drenched in sweat. The Zurichs and the Xylites, who were used to much cooler environments, were beginning to show signs of exhaustion. The humans, though still calm, were also feeling the strain, but they continued to push forward, never showing signs of weakness. Captain Rice Hamilton stood at the front of the room, his shirt long gone, sweat running down his face. His human crew, though clearly tired, remained steady, working together like a well-oiled machine. They had been through tough situations before, but this felt different. The heat was oppressive, and with each passing minute, it was getting harder to breathe. "Riz," Aaron, one of the human crew members, called out from the back. This is getting out of hand. The ship's systems are failing. We need to figure out something fast. Rice turned around, his face grim. I know, Aaron. I know. Keep at it. We'll fix it. Varnak, the Xerix warrior, was still at the control panel, his powerful frame showing signs of struggle. His face was flushed, his breathing labored. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his hands trembled as he tried to make sense of the malfunctioning systems. The cooling system isn't responding, Varnak growled, frustration evident in his voice. I don't know how much longer we can hold out. Lyra, the satellite, stood by, her mind racing. She had always prided herself on her intellect, but right now, all her strategies and calculations seemed useless. The heat had clouded her thoughts, made everything feel distant and unfocused. She looked at the humans, working with determination, and felt a rising sense of frustration. How do they keep going like this? She murmured to herself. Kylan, the other satellite, stood beside her, his face pale. I don't know. It's like they're unaffected by it. Rise, hearing their conversation, glanced over at Lyra. His voice was steady as he spoke. It's not about being unaffected. We're all feeling the heat. It's about pushing through it. You can't let it stop you. You just keep moving. Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with confusion and curiosity. But you don't look tired. How do you do it? Riz paused for a moment, then shrugged. I don't know if there's a trick to it. You just don't give up. The moment you stop trying is the moment you lose. The words hit Lyra harder than she expected. For so long, she had believed that knowledge and intellect were the keys to survival. But now, faced with the unbearable heat and their inability to fix the problem, she was starting to realize that there was something else. Something the humans had that she didn't fully understand. Her mind raced, and for the first time in hours, she felt a spark of clarity. It wasn't just about the heat. It was about the drive to keep going, even when everything seemed impossible. The humans didn't rely on their strength or intellect alone. They relied on their sheer will to survive. Varnak, who had overheard the conversation, grunted. I've had enough of this heat, he muttered. I'll keep working, but we're running out of time. Rez nodded, his expression serious. We're all in this together. Don't forget that. As the minutes ticked by, the heat continued to rise. The ship was on the edge of failure, and the crew was pushing themselves to their limits. Rez could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The humans had been trained to survive in the harshest conditions, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about keeping the crew together. And Rez wasn't about to let that fall apart. The Endeavor was now on the brink. The heat had climbed to a dangerous 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and the crew was feeling the strain in every part of their body. The ship's systems were barely functioning, and the temperature inside was unbearable. The metal walls of the ship seemed to radiate the heat, and even the air vents felt like blasts of hot wind. Captain Rice Hamilton wiped the sweat from his brow, his muscles aching from the heat, but he didn't let it stop him. His crew continued to work with quiet determination, and despite their exhaustion, they remained focused on getting the ship's systems back online. They had been through worse, but this time was different. The situation was far more urgent. Varnak, the Xerix warrior, was at the control panel once again. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements sluggish, but he didn't give up. He had always prided himself on his strength, but this heat was draining him. The Xerix were known for their endurance, but even they had limits. Varnak's hands were shaking as he tried to input commands into the broken system. Lyra, the satellite, watched him with a look of concern. The heat was making it hard for her to think, but she saw the effort Varnak was putting into the repairs. It was the first time she had seen him so vulnerable, and it made her realize how much the aliens were struggling. The pride they once held was slipping away in the face of something they couldn't control. I don't know how much longer we can last, Varnak muttered, wiping his forehead. We're pushing the limits of our endurance. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. She had always been the intellectual, the one who solved problems with logic and reason. But this wasn't a problem that could be solved with knowledge alone. This was about surviving a force of nature, a heatwave that didn't care about their intelligence or strength. "I can't focus," she admitted. "The heat is clouding my thoughts. How are the humans still working like this?" Kylan, the other satellite, was standing nearby, his own face pale with exhaustion. "They've been through hardships before. I think they rely on something else, something we don't understand." Lyra turned to watch Captain Riss, who was calmly directing his crew, keeping everything together with quiet authority. His voice was steady, even as he felt the strain of the heat. The humans didn't seem to be faltering. They were tired, but they kept going, one step at a time. "Maybe we're missing something," Lyra said, her voice thoughtful. "We've always focused on intellect and strength. But what if it's something else, something more internal?" Kylan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Lyra's eyes shone with realization. "The humans, they don't give up. They keep pushing forward even when the situation looks impossible. They rely on willpower, not just their minds or bodies." At that moment, Riss looked over at the aliens. His eyes met Lyra's, and for a brief moment, there was understanding between them. Riss knew that the satellites and Zurichs were struggling, but he also knew they had their own strengths. He could see that they were beginning to realize something important. "We all have our ways of surviving," Riss said, his voice steady. "But sometimes it's not enough to rely on just one. It's about pushing through the hardest times together." Varnak grunted, still focused on the control panel. "You humans, you have something else. It's not strength or intelligence. It's something more." Lyra nodded, a small smile on her face. "Maybe we can learn from you." For the first time since the heat had started, the crew felt a sense of unity. They were no longer just a group of humans and aliens, each struggling in their own way. They were all facing the same challenge together. And in that moment, it didn't matter who was stronger or smarter. What mattered was their ability to push through and survive. The Endeavor was still fighting against the heat, but now the crew was fighting together, united, determined, and more focused than ever. The Endeavor was on its last legs. The heat had reached 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and every inch of the ship felt like an oven. The crew was exhausted, sweat pouring down their faces, their muscles aching, their minds clouded by the oppressive heat. Yet despite everything, they kept going. The ship had become their battleground, and they weren't going to give up. Captain Rice Hamilton stood at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the crew. His face was streaked with sweat, but his expression remained calm. He looked over at his crew, humans, Zurichs, and satellites, all working together, side by side. It was no longer about their differences. It was about survival. Varnak, the Zurich's warrior, was at the control panel again, his massive arms trembling with fatigue. His face was red, his body barely able to hold up, but he refused to stop. His people had never backed down from a fight, and today was no different. He gritted his teeth, determined to make the repairs. "We're almost there," Varnak muttered, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Just a little longer." Lyra, the satellite, stood next to him, her mind finally clearing after hours of exhaustion. The heat had tested her intellect like never before, but now she was beginning to see the bigger picture. The humans had shown her something. It wasn't about being the smartest or the strongest. It was about never quitting, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. They had relied on their willpower to get through this, and now that same strength was coursing through her. "I think we can do this," Lyra said, looking over at Rice. Riz nodded, his eyes focused on the crew. "We can. We just have to keep pushing. Together." Kylan, the other satellite, was working at the engine bay, his hands moving quickly as he checked the systems. He was tired, but the clarity in his mind told him they were so close. The ship's systems were still damaged, but they could repair them. They had to. The humans, working alongside the aliens, were just as determined. Aaron, a member of Rise's crew, called out from across the room. "We've got the backup systems working. The cooling is back online. We can hold out a little longer." A cheer erupted among the crew. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was hope. They had a chance to survive. Rise took a deep breath and walked toward the center of the room, his presence steady and strong. "Great job, everyone. But we're not done yet," Rise said. "We've got to keep working. We've got a long road ahead of us." As the crew worked tirelessly, the temperature slowly began to drop. The Endeavor's cooling systems were starting to take effect, and the unbearable heat was beginning to ease. The air became more breathable, and the oppressive weight on their bodies started to lift. But they knew they couldn't stop now. They still had repairs to finish, and the damage to the ship wasn't fully fixed. Hours passed, and finally, the crew could feel the heat starting to subside. The temperature in the ship was slowly returning to normal. The once oppressive heat was now a memory, and the crew could finally take a breath without feeling like the air was choking them. Riz looked around at his crew, humans and aliens, who were now resting after the long ordeal. They had come together in the face of adversity, and their teamwork had saved them. Varnak, the Zurich's warrior, let out a tired but satisfied grunt. "You humans, you really are different." Lyra smiled, a rare moment of warmth in her face. "We've learned a lot from each other. Maybe we're not so different after all." Riz looked at them all, his face a picture of pride. "We're all survivors, and that's what matters." The Endeavor might have been broken and battered, but the crew had proven that no matter what the universe threw at them, they could survive. Together,